Hello everybody, and we are back to finish up lesson 16.2 on climate change. So we're going to look into the studying of climate change. To understand something that is changing, we need to consider its past and its present. When we can use this information to predict what will happen in the future. Scientists who study climate change can check present-day climate directly, but they have to also develop very clever ways to infer past climates and to predict future change. First, we can do this by direct measurement of present conditions. To study Earth's climate today, scientists measure conditions directly. You know this if you've ever watched the TV weather report. Every day, weather reports give data about temperature, precipitation, wind patterns, and so forth. Over time, records of data such as air temperature and ocean temperature show that modern climate is changing. Proxy indicators can give us clues about past climates. To understand how climate is changing today, scientists must learn what climates were like thousands of years ago. Environmental scientists use clues from the past to do this. Proxy indicators are types of indirect evidence that serve as proxies, or another word for that is substitutes, for direct measurement. Proxy indicators shed light on past climate. So here you see a climate scientist inspecting tree rings, and you also see an image of a cross-section of the tree trunk. So let's talk about some of the different ways or different proxy climate indicators that can be useful. Each of them are also useful only for a given period of time. But the ones we're going to talk about are ice, sediments, and tree rings. So here you can see our ice core, and that can give scientists information about the environment at the time that the ice was formed. We have tree rings, so we can see the different, for each year that the tree grows, it will gain an additional ring, and if there's any trauma or weather conditions, we can see scarring or the different widths of the growth ring indicate how quickly it grew. So we kind of know if it was a wet and warm environment, so there was lots of growth, or maybe it was a very cold and dry environment, so we see very thin rings or not a lot of growth. And then the last image over here we see is soil samples. So soil samples can be taken at different depths, and sometimes we even do soil samples really deep, like a mile deep. And so you'll see that the different levels are kind of stacked here, showing at different depths what the soil type was like. So let's talk about what kind of information and why do we use these techniques to gather information. Well, clues and ice. Earth's ice sheets and glaciers hold clues to climate history. As glaciers and ice sheets form, tiny bubbles of air become trapped inside. Scientists use special tools to remove long columns or cores of ice. From these ice cores, scientists can determine such things as greenhouse gas concentrations in the ancient atmosphere and temperature trends. Even trapped soot particles have a tale to tell. The soot indicates how often forest fires happened. Frequent forest fires can indicate a time of drought. So what about our sediments? Sediments consist of particles of rock and soil that have been deposited by wind, water, or ice. Researchers take samples from beds of sediment beneath bodies of water. Ancient sediments often preserve pollen grains and other parts of plants that grew in the past. Climate influences the type of plants that grow in an area. Therefore, if scientists know what plants grew in the location at the time, they can often infer or make an educated guess about what the climate was at that place and time. Lastly, we have our tree rings. The scientists in figure 8 on the last slide were examining rings in an old tree. Tree rings in old trees can be a proxy indicator. A pair of light and dark rings represents 1 year's growth. The width of each ring of a tree trunk reveals how much the tree grew in a particular growing season. A wide ring means more growth, generally indicating a wetter year, or in some areas, a wetter year. By analyzing certain chemical characteristics of tree rings, scientists can get information about hurricane activity that happened hundreds of years ago. Long-lived trees such as redwoods and bristlecone pines can provide indications of precipitation and drought going back hundreds of years. And like ice cores, tree rings can show past forest fires. A charred tree ring indicates that the fire took place during that year. Now we're going to talk about modeling, which is making predictions about the future. Environmental scientists try to understand how climate functions. They then use this understanding to predict future climate change. To do both these tasks, scientists present climate processes with computer programs known as climate models. A climate model is a program or programs that combine what is known about the atmosphere and the oceans to simulate or imitate climate processes called climate models. Climate models are enormous amounts of data and complex mathematical equations. You can see this on the figure on your slide, and it shows the kinds of information that go into the climate model. So in this model, we can see a lot of things happening. We have a mountain covered in snow. Some of that snow is undergoing evaporation and going right back into the atmosphere. That's happening because of the incoming solar energy. It comes in, hits the earth, it heats up, and it releases that heat into the atmosphere. Of course, not all of that snow or ice is going to evaporate into the atmosphere. A lot of it is going to turn into fresh water, waters and streams or rivers. And that water is going to go from the highest point and run down to the lowest point and be run off and enter a lake, pond, or ocean. We can see that the way that this model is affected also takes into account snow coverage, vegetation, the topography, right? How many mountains and the rivers there are, and the land use. So if we had a farm or something going on here, that of course would change the dynamics of this model. Once you have evaporation occur and you have all that water vapor in the atmosphere, those clouds are forming. Once those clouds get nice and full, they are going to condense and then precipitate, which means rain, snow, or sleet is going to fall out of the sky and back down to earth, where it starts to cycle all over again. Alright, so we're going to take a look at this real data. This is changing temperature of the atmosphere. This graph here shows us the temperature of the atmosphere that has changed since 1850. The 0 point on the y-axis, right here, marks the average atmospheric temperature for the year between 1961 and 1990. So, number 1, interpret graphs. What is the overall trend shown on this graph? Well, when we look at a trend on a graph like this, you want to basically, if you take a ruler and you set it on one edge and then you line it up on the other edge, if it's increasing in this direction, you would say the trend is increasing. If your ruler, when you set it here, your other endpoint was down here, we would consider that decreasing. But clearly, we can see an increasing trend. Number 3, interpret graphs. Describe the temperature pattern between 1850 and 1910. So if we look at this area in here, we're going to say that the temperature trended up and then it trended back down. Compare and contrast. Number 4, contrast the temperature pattern after 1910 to the pattern before that year. Well, we don't have a lot of data before this, but we can see that although we have increases and decreases, it seems to be rather stable. But after this 1910 cutoff, we are seeing a steady increase in temperature. Number 5, predict. How would the trend show on the graph affect the Maldives? Well, we would say we're expecting to continue to see a increase in temperature based on the current trend. So something would have to happen to correct that trend to go to decrease. So as of right now, we're expecting a continued increase. Well, if the temperatures are increasing, we would expect more glaciers to thaw and the temperature of the water to increase, both of which would increase the rise of water, and then ultimately we might see the Maldive Islands disappear. I would like you to go ahead and take a minute or a few minutes to pause this video and go watch the first link listed here, which is indicators of climate change. I've also provided for you some additional supplemental videos to watch, which is how scientists actually look at and collect different samples to study climate. The first is on tree rings, the next is looking at ice cores, and then the third is looking at sediments. After you've watched those videos, go ahead and for your classwork, turn to page 289 and answer questions 1 through 4. All right, now that you guys have finished answering those couple of questions, we're going to talk about finding the cause of climate change. So in 1958, a scientist named Charles Keeling started to measure carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Keeling collected air samples about every hour at the Mauna Observatory in Hawaii, and he measured the carbon dioxide in those samples. Since then, scientists have continued to measure the levels of carbon dioxide every day in Mauna around the clock. The data collected from the Mauna show that in 1958, a concentration of carbon dioxide was 315 parts per million, or ppm. In contrast, the concentration was 387 ppm in 2009. The carefully recorded data of Keeling and his associates show that carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere is indeed increasing. According to the IPCC, the rising levels of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are responsible for most of the increase in atmospheric temperature. The high levels of greenhouse gases are increasing the greenhouse effect. So in the graph here, we can see it's showing how the concentration of different greenhouse gases has changed over time. We can see carbon dioxide indicated in purple, nitrous oxide indicated in red, and methane indicated in green. And then we can see as the years progress, we start to see a sharp incline of all of those gases. So, this figure, figure 10, shows that carbon dioxide is not the only greenhouse gas whose concentration has been increasing. Most other greenhouse gases cause more warming than carbon dioxide, molecule for molecule. However, because carbon dioxide is so abundant, it is the greenhouse gas that is most responsible for global warming. Most scientists agree that the extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has come from human activities, such as the use of motor vehicles. Burning fossil fuels. The main source of extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is the burning of carbon-containing fuels, such as oil, natural gas, and coal, which are all used for energy. These fuels are called fossil fuels because they formed long ago from the remains of living things. Use of fossil fuels has been increasing ever since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which happened about 200 years ago. The Industrial Revolution started a shift from farming to industry as a way of producing goods that people use. Industry uses machinery, and machinery runs on fossil fuels. During the last 200 years, people have used an increasing amount of fossil fuels in homes, cars, and industries. As the fossil fuels release carbon dioxide, the greenhouse effect increases and the temperature of the atmosphere continues to rise. This results in changes of use of land. Land use changes, such as the cutting of forests, also have caused an increase in greenhouse gases. Remember that plants, including trees, take in carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. Therefore, the loss of forests contributes to an increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Go ahead and stop here, and for classwork, I'd like you to answer your questions in your workbook, page 289, numbers 1 through 4. All right, guys. Next homework assignment is please go ahead and read in your Pearson e-text page 508 through 509. It's a quick article called Science Behind the Stories, Climate Clues in the Ice. Then I'd like you to answer on Pearson. It will be assigned through the Pearson website. Write about it. Science Behind the Stories, Climate Clues on Ice. This concludes chapter 16.2. So let's go ahead and review the concepts that we learned yesterday and today. First, we learned about evidence of global climate change, including rising atmospheric temperature, precipitation trends, melting ice, and rising seas. Next, we learned that scientists study changes in climate by taking direct measurements, inferring past climate characteristics, and using models to predict the future. And last, we saw evidence indicating that global warming has been caused largely by the increase of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Make sure you guys take the time to stop here. Make sure that you've completed all your classwork, homework, and watched all the appropriate videos posted on LMS. And guys, remember, once you're done, make sure to print or at least pull up the PDF copy of the PowerPoint so you can check and verify all of your answers.